What is up, everybody? Mr. Apprentice here. Welcome to the second part of Imperialism. The first part, we talked about the causes and the motivations for Europeans to go out and attempt to conquer parts of the world. In this one, we're going to talk about two specific areas, India and China, that are going to be imperialized or taken over by European countries. And I want to start here with India. If you don't recognize India, that's this area right here. India, this is obviously the satellite view. If you didn't learn this last year, a couple important geographic features of India. One, in the northeast, we have the Himalaya Mountains, which are the largest mountain chain in the world and an easy barrier to protect against invaders, which leaves China pretty well insulated and isolated. Also over here in the northeast, we have some plateaus and some high elevation areas, as well as some desert that also protects them. There is some fertile land in India. It's kind of sporadically spread out throughout the subcontinent, including some areas down here that are a little less fertile, which is shown by this kind of beigeish tannish color. But what I want to point out that's probably the most significant for today is this is the Indian Ocean here. The Europeans have been trading in this Indian Ocean since the age of exploration, what you talked about in Global One. One of the main motivations for the age of exploration was getting to India and trading some of the products that the Indians have. The biggest product that they were looking for, well, two big products. One was cotton and one was sugar. And these two products that the Europeans can then bring back and sell in their own marketplace markets, there's that term that we kind of talked about in class, can be brought into the marketplace and sold in Europe for high prices. So by the time we get to the 1750s and 1800s, the Industrial Revolution is going on. So the Europeans are still have a high demand for cotton. Kind of a nice little connection here that if you can make this is, they had been using their colonies in the Americas for cotton, but those colonies, many of them have gained their independence. So the Europeans really need a new access for cotton because the British especially can't grow cotton in Britain. The climate just doesn't allow it. So India has that, which is a positive. Also, we have tobacco, which is a highly addictive product. And even more addictive than tobacco is this right here. This is called the poppy plant. And the poppy plant is produces this sap right here, which is discovered that you can smoke it and it gets someone very, very high. And this level of intoxication that the drug provides, it makes it very addictive. And this poppy plant and the sap that comes off it is the basis of heroin today. So if you've seen anything in the newspaper about the heroin epidemic in Long Island, much of the heroin comes from this region in northeast or northwest India as well as Afghanistan. And a lot of this sap is going to be used and smoked back then, not as heroin, but as opium. And this opium drug is going to become highly addictive. And essentially, if you can get control of this poppy plant, you can get control of almost the drug industry, essentially, as a European. So the Europeans have been there and kind of hanging out trading. They're not in control of India up to this point, but there are merchants who are there. And these merchants, who are British merchants, start to gain power and influence in India. And as they gain power and influence, they realize they need soldiers. But Europeans, especially British, are not going to come to India to provide soldiers for these merchants. So the British merchants start hiring Indian soldiers. And these are the Indian soldiers. They're called sepoys. And these sepoys, for about 150 years, are really treated pretty poorly, but they get paid somewhat well enough to continue to do this job. And for years, the British treat them bad and bad and bad. And finally, kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back is there are rumors spread in 1857 that the cartridge for the Enfield rifle that is being used by these sepoys that the British are giving them to use is covered in pig and cow fat. Now, one, it's just gross, but if you know anything about the people who live in India, they're primarily Hindu and Muslims, and Hindus revere or find holiness in the cow. And if it's greased with cow fat, that's sacrilegious to them. It's against their religion. Hindus don't eat red meat. And some of the people who are sepoys are also Muslim. And if you cover it in pig, Muslims don't eat pork. So in many ways, doing this, the sepoys view as a cultural insensitivity. And the sepoys rise up sporadically and rebel against these British merchants. And this is what the cartridge looked like. You literally take it in your mouth and bite off the end of the capsule and pour in the gunpowder, push it down and to shoot. As a result of this rebellion, and it's a 3-year rebellion from 1857, 58, and 59, the British come in with their military and squash this rebellion. And they punish the sepoys. This is kind of one of the images that were drawn of a sepoy being strapped to a cannon, and the cannon is going to be shot and the cannonball into the individual. As a result of all this, the British decides, the government itself of Britain, not the merchants, decide to come in and take over the rest of India. They conquer it. And this is British India in 1900. Because India has so many natural resources that can be used and sold and made money, India gets the nickname of Britain, the jewel of the crown. And just kind of a symbol here, this is a crown, this is a British crown, and the jewel of the crown would refer to the one piece of the crown that is the most valuable. And although this crown will make up all of Britain's colonies, the India part is its jewel, is its most important part. So India is going to be conquered. The people in India are going to be treated poorly, which we'll get into a little bit later. And eventually we'll have a guy named Gandhi who's going to try and rise up and get the British out, who I'm sure, hopefully you've heard of at some point. Also, we have China, and this is what China looks like from their satellite view. We have fertile land primarily in eastern China, and then we have these natural barriers. Down here is the Himalayas again. We have the Gobi Desert up here, and just areas that are difficult. So throughout most of China's history, they're also isolated. And the Europeans, during the Age of Exploration, were trying to get to China as well to trade some of their silk, spices. They had a lot of different products that the Europeans wanted. Another one was porcelain, aka China. So if you have fancy China at your house, that's porcelain that came from China. And what the Europeans find, for years, they couldn't find a product that the Chinese wanted. And after kind of taking over India, they realized that the Chinese have a liking for opium. And the Chinese begin to get, especially the upper class and upper middle class Chinese people, get highly addicted to opium. It gets so bad in China that people start opening up these opium dens, where like there are these little clubs almost where you go, someone would smoke opium and then sleep there until they wake up later, and someone will come around and offer them more opium. And we have these people who are upper class and upper middle class government officials, high ranking people who start living in these opium dens because they're so addicted to opium. And as a result of this, the British or the Chinese government says, we need to stop selling opium. We can't have the British coming in here as drug dealers and addicting our whole population to this opium. So the Chinese government says, we're banning it. And Britain says, no, you don't. We're not letting you ban it. And the Chinese government says, you got to stop dealing drugs here. Sorry about that. You got to stop dealing drugs here. And as a result of this, the British says to the Chinese government, who just wants them to stop selling opium, we're going to go to war. And the war is literally called the Opium Wars. It's like, we're calling it after the drug. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's over this drug. And the Opium Wars fought. There's actually two wars that are fought, and it's the British versus the Chinese. And the Chinese are not industrialized, and the British are. So the British easily defeat the Chinese. And when people generally win wars, they punish the loser. And in this case, the Chinese are forced to sign something called the Treaty of Nanjing. And Nanjing is a city in China, the capital city, which is going to split China up into what is called spheres of influence. This is an important term for this period and something that you definitely need to remember. And spheres of influence just means that there are areas that are going to be split up, but in this like little spheres, little areas where different European countries are going to have influence over that region. So the British get part of it, the French, the Japanese, the Russian, the Ottoman, and don't pay too much attention to this area. There's really not much there. This is the area where a lot of the good stuff in China happens. And China, for their first time in history, are forced to completely open up to Westerners. They've isolated Westerners since the first Westerner came back in the 1500s. And now we're going to really just totally isolate them and, kind of condense. They can go wherever they want, which is a pretty big deal in China. But the Chinese people have been historically ethnocentric. They don't want all of these Westerners. And by Westerner, I mean the British and the French and the Germans. They don't want them in their country. So there's also going to be a rebellion in China of a group of people called the Boxers. And the Boxers are martial artists. And they were believed to have these mystical powers that they could levitate and do what we would consider kind of modern day magical stuff that people couldn't understand. And this boxer group, these martial artists, rise up against the Westerners. And this is a picture of the Westerners who came to put, some of the Westerners, not all of them, who came to put down. You'll notice they are diverse. They're from multiple different countries, and they squash and stop the Boxer Rebellion. And as a result of this, China is forced to open up, all as a result of the opium that was being sold that the Chinese government didn't want to have. The Chinese are not going to be happy. The British are happy. And as a result of all of this, we see China and India both imperialized. So theme here, both natural resources the Europeans want, the Europeans are able to conquer because of superior technology, and the people who live in those countries try to rise up and stop this from happening unsuccessfully because of the Europeans' advantage of technology. That's what I got. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, as always, write it down and let me know. Have a good day.